Thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to join you today.
So I can reiterate and emphasize how long it's taken. So we're on episode number 26 now, and I think we were after Fiona as a guest before episode 10. So I echo Maeve's sentiments. I'm really, really excited about the podcast today and what we're going to speak to you about.
I'm pleased to be here.
Okay, Fiona. So I guess let's start at the very beginning. You are the co-founder of the Wave Clinic. I am super excited to hear about how that came about and why young people, for example, instead of adults, and maybe you could give us a bit of background on that.
Yeah, you're right. So the wave looks after just young people, and that was very much a choice. Having worked with young people and families for really quite a long time, because I started to hear the same stories over and over again, and it was about um, understanding. Kids are, on the whole, very insightful. So understanding that something's not sitting quite right for me, or I'm feeling that I'm not, not where I want to be. But the resistance to getting any help from that, particularly residential help, was on what was lost. So everybody's having their first university experience. My friends have had their first boyfriend. I'm not going to be able to sit my A levels this summer. So it was all about the repeated stories of loss. I'm going to miss my dog because I'm going to be homesick. I can't. So when I was kind of thinking about, well, how can I do something that's really different? It was that sense of loss that I wanted to mitigate against, and how can I get to a point where young people, let's face it, we're not ever going to be their super destination of choice, because it's something that nobody ever hopes that they're going to need, or their children are going to need, or their brother or sister are going to need. But when you do need us, how can we leave you in a place where you leave us with something more than you came with, that's tangible? So you're ending up with a position of advantage rather than this sort of perception of loss and disadvantage. So that was the original sort of thinking of how do I create this thing that is. You said that mental health treatment had to be grey and boring. I'm not sure where that came from, but it's standard. So it was, how can I create something that, if it's possible to put sparkle in it, we do. If it's possible to throw glitter on it, we will. And how can we make that into something that is desirable while you're in it? So you're not spending your whole time with one foot on the plane wishing you were at home. You've got both feet into the experience that you're actually having. So that was the sort of original thinking of why and how I started to put some pieces together.
It's really interesting, Fiona, and I think it resonates with me quite a bit because I signed a record deal straight out of school and went travelling, but had significant mental health problems and an eating disorder. I never had the opportunity to, have that first boyfriend with my friends, or go to the cinema with my friends, or because I was out working doing this job that everyone thought was, the dream job. Whereas I was really
Yeah.
struggling. So that really resonates with me, and I think the other thing that resonates with me is the 7 elements that you have worked into the wave. So having that kind of experience, almost like a gap year, where you're learning alongside recovering, and I think that's really incredible.
Yeah, that's been massively important, not just for the young people, but for their families. Because I think there's a lot of big feelings in families when you're making a decision to move to residential treatment. And some of that for parents is around loss, shame, guilt. Is it all my fault? Could I have done something different? How much damage have I done here? Who have I broken? All those, really kind of critical, mean thoughts that as parents we can have a lot of the time. So building something in where, I don't know about you, Maeve, but I certainly would have loved the opportunity to go on a gap year to Asia, in my teens, and I think it's such a lovely opportunity for young people, and if we can sort of fold in very nicely all of the elements that they need, and knowing that that stuff's really tough work, that we can make the other bits really fun. Lots of our young people come to us with really significant issues around interpersonal relationships, whether that's in the family, because they're our first set of interpersonal relationships, or within the sort of wider school network, or within themselves. to be able to work on that in a group setting through some of those fun activities is just amazing. And I am actually, I always think about your early career and making that move at such a young age. And I know you and I have talked about that before. And the creative arts are something that we bring in a lot. We've got a lot of young people who are incredibly talented, sometimes from also incredibly talented, high profile families who are already in that space. So there's an added pressure, I'm sure, to be the best at whatever it is that they're sort of embarking on. So we're really trying to build that in, that creative arts element. I don't know whether you've had a look at our Instagram over the last week, but we did a dual performance of The Wizard of Oz and went straight into Wicked. It was a 4-hour performance, and the costumes were amazing, the performances were amazing, the fun had was amazing, the behind the scenes battles were all things that went straight back into our process groups and were live examples of how we connect and how we can be better connectors and better friends and experience things in a slightly different way than perhaps we would at home.
I love, Fiona, the sprinkling sparkles on it comment, because whenever I think about kind of traumatic or difficult experiences, and then time passing, and then having to think about revisiting some of that stuff, the immediate emotional connection to that generally tends to be negative or fear, or so. I think the fact that you've explained that, it is going to be tough, but actually we can make the most of this time together, that is amazing. I think that's a message that needs to get out there more often. But one of the questions I had is around, the residential care piece, and I'm guessing, but please validate or otherwise, that by being in a single place for a period of time, it does allow the person to have that focus that maybe isn't attainable when there's kind of daily routine going on. So if you could speak a little bit about the benefits of residential care. I mean, the benefits of Malaysia, I think, speak for themselves. But the benefits of residential care versus trying to work through something in a standard setting that you're used to would be really helpful, I think.
Mhm. That's an amazing kind of sort of question, and there's so many bits that come off of that. And I think the residential piece is fear laden. It has a certain sort of stigma attached to it historically. It's got all those big feelings around it. So having having the beautiful location of Malaysia, and we are truly, truly, truly blessed that Malaysia has allowed us to make it our home, and it's been exceptional for our young people. Um, Young people who are traveling to us from the US, we're so far away from an insurance model of that sort of like um, tick box mental health treatment that I think many of us have come to experience. So just being in Malaysia is superb. It's also allowed us to get involved in things that we couldn't with, with all the wish and the will to do this in the UK or the US. We just wouldn't be able to. At one day a week, our young people go off, and we've been supporting the Chin schools, the Chin population in Myanmar, who are, um, quite often find themselves displaced, and particularly young children displaced. We've been working with an NGO for the last 7 years, the Chin School. Our young people have the opportunity, first of all, to start and finish something in their diploma in classroom teaching assistants. Lots of our young people never have managing to kind of get to the end of something before, particularly educationally. So having this opportunity to finish something, then go and use that by teaching one day a week in pairs, teaching basic maths and English to these, wonderful children from pre-kindergarten up to about 14, who are then having amazing English native speakers coming in and giving them some of the skills that wouldn't otherwise be available to them. Just the very, the very benefit of going to school for these young people is something they wouldn't otherwise have. So some of those things we wouldn't be able to do in many other locations. So that's been brilliant. And then there's some of the things about residential that you mentioned. Some of it's related to risk. So a lot of the young people that we work with are what we would consider to be relatively moderate to high and more, uh, perhaps severe risk factors. So that might mean that there's reoccurring self-harm. That the eating disorder presentation is one that is medically impacting. We know that they medically impact all the time, but to the degree of severity where community treatment's no longer possible. It might be that there's been recent suicide attempts, that all suicide attempts are really important. And of course, we want to take all of them seriously. And then within that, there are some that preclude young people from taking part in outpatient or partial hospitalisation treatment. So the residential aspect allows us to really hold and embrace young people who may be already feeling like they didn't quite fit, get pushed away from services as well. And that's a regular thing we hear from parents. My child doesn't fit the admission criteria, my child doesn't fit the risk protocol, my child isn't okay, is the message that kids hear and that parents hear. So that's a benefit. We get to be able to provide that beautiful, gentle, activity-based, trust-based experience for young people. And I think then there's also, we know that young people don't get to this place all by themselves. They're the ones that, they wear the t-shirt with the diagnosis that often happens many, many years after the onset of their, whatever's happening for them. I'm going to use the word symptoms. I'd rather I found a different one, but I hope that you can hear that that's said with love. Whatever they're presenting with can take a very long time to get to the point that actually somebody says, this makes sense to me, and from here I can plan for how to make this less impactful for you. So I think when young people have been waiting for a very long time in that system, they're waiting in a basin where this started. So we know that rather than things being essentially an individual pattern of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, it's kind of inside this sort of goldfish bowl that is the family. They're the biggest influence. We're talking about children and adolescents. Family relationships incredibly impactful and powerful for good. And there's protective factors in that, the positivity and the warmth that come from family relationships. And there's also the criticality, the what we term as hostility or the prickliness. And sometimes we sort of looking at something that we call emotional over-involvement in families. And all of those things together work. There's something that's happening two ways. So this bidirectionality, the more unwell your child becomes, the higher you react. So we talk about this thing of expressed emotion in families, familial expressed emotion in your caregiving kind of bowl. And as children become more unwell, understandably, it's not a static process. Parents become more afraid. And we just touched on eating disorders. We know that eating disorders have a higher mortality rate than any other psychiatric illness. Imagine parenting a child for whom that that's happening, and waking up not knowing whether they're going to wake up. So I think it's not surprising that families under stress and pressure react in ways that sometimes are unhelpful, and sometimes, with the best will in the world and wanting to be super helpful, they can actually reinforce the whole position of the illness. So by moving that young person, it allows us to work really well with the families. So we're starting to bring that high expressed emotion down, and get something that we would kind of want to see decreasing. And we also get to work with the young person on their experience of themselves and their experience of themselves within all those different roles they have: sister, daughter, friend, pupil, dancer, whatever it might be. So I think residential treatment allows us to work in a way where we can work with risk, work safely with risk, and embrace the whole family system in what is essentially for us a really beautiful environment with monkeys jumping around in the garden.
So great. And a follow-up question to that, Fiona, was around how you typically find young people presenting themselves. And you touched on a really interesting topic there around kind of conformity or conformity to models that exist within healthcare services generally. And so do you find that there's almost, in some cases at least, some desperation around, a plea to help because those checkboxes haven't been ticked, and therefore there's a refusal to help in the domestic setting? Do you see that a lot, or is that kind of inconsistent?
No, I think you're right there as well. In that's a really powerful topic for us to explore. It's really difficult to get help. It's really difficult for young people and families to get help. And I think when you really are at your wit's end, and that's how parents, I experience parents on that first call of, I've knocked on many, many, many doors here, and there's nobody answering, or we don't meet the checkbox criteria for certain reasons. If we go back to eating disorders again, I know I've touched on them a few times now, but um, you going to your GP, waiting for your appointment with your GP. We understand that. We understand why that happened. It's probably beyond the scope of our discussion today to work out why healthcare isn't freely available. But um, you're knocking on the door. You get there to be met with, well, on a weight basis, you don't meet the criteria for anything right now. And how distressing that is to hear for a young person. The invitation is go get more unwell. Right. I'm here today in front of you because I need some help. I'm not able to get that help. So, what you're telling me is that I need to go and be a better, whatever the thing is that they're presenting with, in order for you to hear me. Young people will readily take up your offer on that. And I think that's happening, particularly in the UK, where, that's really important to you guys. That That's the story that we hear really often. You don't meet the criteria based on weight, shape, and size, for example. So that's then holding up this really outdated theory that eating disorders are built on something that's on your plate. The reality of what is on your plate is a thing that changes the way, but it doesn't work like that. It's not about that. In part, yes, the food has part to play in what we're talking about, but how did that young person get there? And most importantly, what's maintaining it? And then I think that goes all the way back again to, if the theories and the options for care, so for example, NICE guidelines, 2017 guidelines for eating disorders, make suggestions for the treatment of children and adolescents. None of them explicitly look at the family system and the family relationships. So if we're not even kind of acknowledging that it's there, then we're going to not often make the criteria. I think there's a great study by Janet Treasure and her colleagues at King's and the Maudsley that looks at young people who've been diagnosed with anorexia. 2% of them attribute that to something to do with weight and shape. 43% of them attribute that to something to do with interpersonal relationships.
Yeah.
So
Uh,
if we get to the GP and he ticks based on what your BMI is, which we all know was never designed by the Belgian mathematician who designed it for the use that it has today, how can we possibly help young people if our foundations are not in place?
So 20 years ago, that was my story. Fiona went to the doctors, wasn't the correct weight for diagnosis. But what was really interesting then is that it started to become my identity. My identity was actually I'm ill, rather than I'm a musician. I'm a daughter. I'm a mother. And I wonder whether you see that with your young people, that it becomes their identity that's wrapped up in all of this illness and
Yeah.
diagnosis, which becomes really difficult to break away from. And then I'm reminded of the Judith Herman model of safety and stabilisation, about how that's the most important bit. So coming into inpatient care for me was about that safety and stabilisation, chipping away at the identity bit, and really realising that you're more than your diagnosis. Like teaching, for example, that's a great way to show someone that they are really useful and part of something much bigger than themselves.
And there's something there just before Fiona comes in. There's something really powerful there, I think, around taking on a personality that becomes almost self-fulfilling. So the big challenge is how do you find yourself, right? How do you find yourself again, reconnect with yourself? And that, I guess, is a process. And sorry, Fiona, for jumping in, but I thought it was really powerful.
Yep.
Mm. Yeah, it was. And thank you for allowing us that little window into your experience, and allowing us to kind of bring that into a bigger picture, because I think what you experienced is what kids tell me and young people tell me every day of the week. And we see, you know, therapeutically, we see it does become the identity, and the identity within that then becomes sort of sub identities around, not only is the illness the bulk of me, my identity today, but then little bits of that where I need to be the most unwell. So there's a competitiveness or whatever within that system, which of course you can see within residential units, and you need to be very, very sort of smart to be on the lookout for that. But the thing with identity is nobody's going to give that up if they haven't got something to replace it, which is where all these wonderful kind of gap year sparkly experiences come from. Putting things in your path that you can trip over and find out that actually you've got a talent at, or a love for, or just a curiosity of being able to jump in there. And I think that's, you know, that's something that's super important. But we can map that over to the adult world, and we may be superb at our job, and then, oh, people going into retirement. You know, I am a policeman. I've been a policeman for 40 years. I'm now going to retire. What happens to my identity? So we're not talking about something that we don't understand happens across the board, with or without a magical diagnosis in place. We won't give something up unless we've got something else that's equal to or better than what we have. And whether that's the identity in the family, or if you've got, we work with a lot of twins. A lot of twins present a lot of the time, and some triplets actually. That's I always, you know, the triplet situation we don't see quite as often. But if you've got twins who have had to essentially share part of their story right from the get-go, and you've got one of them who's very talented, maybe at running, or very academic, and then you've got the other one who doesn't quite feel that they fit the expectations that mum and dad have now got. But the identity can be that I'm very, very good at cutting, I'm very, very good at scaring mum and dad, I'm very, very good at, so I'm getting, by hook or by crook, I'm getting something within that family system. And to go back to eating disorder again, the same researchers at Maudsley talked about eating disorders as being visible and valuable. And if we think about eating disorders as an identity construct, they're one of the only mental health conditions that you can see with the naked eye. So people will see, particularly parents will see, a body that is changing shape, and will make some attempt, usually, to interact with the young person. So it has got this valuable element around identity as well. And I think the valuable part of it is something that's quite often missed. It's valuable to the young person.
One question, and without getting too deep on this, because I don't think it's particularly helpful, but I've got to ask the question. So when any person, a young person or otherwise, identifies with their identity, if that makes sense, is there an element in there of is there an element, regardless of what that identity is, but of attachment through attention? So what I mean by that is, if I'm identity A and I'm not really getting feedback from my environment or from my social networks on identity A, but suddenly I'm identity B by accident or self-consciously, and my goodness, all of a sudden my social networks have lit up, and I seem to be getting a lot more attention, and actually now I'm gonna find that difficult, because of our human traits, to kind of disassociate with potentially some really damaging or unhelpful identity behaviors, if that makes sense. So what I'm saying is, if that must be hard to go through that process, right? And I don't know whether I'm on the right track here, but it seems to me that regardless of my identity, if I'm getting recognized for that and attention and acknowledged for that, then it's going to be very difficult for me to start to change that regardless of what that identity looks like.
It's interesting because when I was in inpatient care, one of the doctors said to me, it's not attention seeking, it's connection seeking. And I thought that was a really nice way of putting what was going on with me. Actually, it was just those connections, those interpersonal connections and relationships that just weren't firing off for me. So that it wasn't about attention seeking, it was connection seeking. And I thought that was a really lovely way to put it.
It's a much better way of putting it. But that was part of it.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
For me,
okay.
anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's another really important area that we understand is part of what happens, and we could reframe it and switch all that around and say, I am protecting myself from rejection, or I am protecting myself from being abandoned. And are there patterns that we know that are more likely to provoke that type of defense mechanism within a child or a young person? Yes, there are. So the not fitting in. If we look at school bullying, for example, not fitting into a social group. In fact, it becomes worse than that. I'm actively harmed within that social group. I'm looking for something. Then we've got sort of diet culture or mental health culture now, and I think you touched a little bit there on what might happen on and offline. And of course, this happens both. We've got communities online where people are connecting through mental health diagnosis, or using that as a way to be able to build subgroups and to actually find themselves belonging. There's absolutely nothing wrong in any level on belonging. It is absolutely the human condition, and wanting to be a part of being somewhere. It can all be very much kind of reinforcing of some of the things that are the most difficult for these young people to kind of work with. I think if we look at body shape and size again, because our culture in particular, in fact, pretty much most cultures have an opinion on body shape and size. You can be anywhere and somebody will tell you, oh, you seem to have changed shape, you seem to have lost weight. You might find yourself being invited to more parties. It might be because of that, but it might not be because of that. um, you might find yourself being asked out on a date for the first time ever. It might be because of your body shape and size. It also completely might not be. But young people will attach it probably to something that's changed for them. And so therefore they want to become better at that. But more importantly, they don't want to give that up because it means going back to the thing that was most painful. So this becomes the plaster that holds you away from these really, really uncomfortable feelings. With eating disorders in particular, when they're in an active phase, there is a sort of numbing that comes with that kind of whole active process. So numbing to many things, but also numbing to some of the really uncomfortable feelings, you sort of overriding them with something else, and something that's incredibly dangerous.
So I'm curious, given everything we sort of unpacked over the last couple of minutes, what would a typical day look like for someone that was in the Wave Clinic?
It looks a lot of fun, I hope. It also looks like a lot of hard work for young people, and for the amazing teams that we have looking after those young people every day round the clock. So I think most importantly, we've already touched upon risk level and making sure people, you mentioned safety and stabilization. Like we need that before we do anything else. How do we get some of that? We get some of that by being visible and heard in ourselves. So we've got a team that's there around the clock. And then the day looks like everybody being woken up by our outgoing medical team overnight. We, in some of our houses, we'll have a peer house leader, and they get the job of going to bounce on the beds in the morning and wake everybody up with a happy smile. It's nearly Chinese New Year, and what we have at that time is we have the lovely lions coming in, and they go and jump on the beds because it's good luck. So everybody loves the lions coming in, and the little lucky charms that they bring with them. But they wake up at the same time. 4 different levels of care. So 4 slightly different things happen because young people within that have slightly different needs. And we are there to be this incredibly safe, holding, gentle family environment. So you're not going to see a doctor's coat or a stethoscope walking around our hallways. There's no need. We believe that, you know, every intervention that we have has the opportunity of being a therapeutic one. So we're as happy to stand and talk on the stairs on the way down to breakfast as we are to have a session in a room with 2 little chairs and a table. So that the everything we do is sort of very flexible and fluid. But waking up, going to have breakfast, we have really family style dining with team members present to keep conversation going, because sometimes when you're in a not very well spaced for many reasons, the whole thing about eating, talking, trying to kind of sit with whatever's going on for you is pretty difficult. So we have team members there. We also have colouring. We have a music playlist. So we have an hour-long music playlist, and that's a little bit like being in a car. You know, when you were small and you're going on a journey and you keep saying, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" So if we're having to put meal observations in place for some of our sort of more the young people at the beginning end of their journey where they're needing a little bit more support, then we've got 60-minute or 30-minute playlists. So you don't have to keep looking for a clock or saying when can I, when will I, when is it? So the whole community put together their favourite tracks. So we have that playing in the background as a much more gentle way of keeping our timing and working out what's good for our bodies than any other way of doing it. Playing Uno, playing Monopoly Deal, playing all of those things that are a distraction. Distractions don't cure self-harm or eating disorders or anything else, but they help us to stay very much connected again in the moment. So we talk about the definition of mental health for us being flexibility. And because we know the more unwell you become, the more rigid your thinking styles comes. Everything becomes very black or white, in or out. So lots of the things that we do, we talk about flexibility and staying in the grey. So we're kind of moving as a whole, we're staying in the grey, we're eating together. We may have some young people who need an hour's worth of kind of observations to settle or to get through their mealtime. So we're all going to take part in that today. We're going to be flexible around the games that we play or the drama initiatives that we take, or how we get through that time together. Then we go off and we get ready for the day. Self-care is really important. So we have a sort of dedicated time where we do showers and brush teeth and make sure that everybody is caught up with that. And that sounds very, very simple. But when you're feeling pretty unwell, particularly about things like depression, where self-care can be really tricky, where we've got young people who may have very sort of high risk situations where that's gone by the wayside. So doing that together, relearning that is really useful. So we do that. Then we go into a group. Our longest group of the day is in the morning because that's when our activity levels are at their kind of highest, and we're ready to go. So a group might be a process group. If it's something that's talk based, we'll make sure that we don't do that in the next group. So we're not just talking. It's really difficult to be an active listener. It's really difficult to stay connected as a young person. Neurodiversity, all of the bits that we deal with and can be challenging for young people to sit there in group after group, it doesn't help at all. So one group, then we have a break. We have a snack in that break because we use a 3-3-3 kind of meal structure. So we've got 3 meals, 3 snacks, no more than really 3 hours apart, so that we're keeping our energy levels nice and stable, rather than doing this and getting over hungry or getting tired or finding that a bigger meal at that point is really difficult. So bringing some structure in around all aspects of self-care. Second group will be the opposite to the first. So it's going to be something that's, if we've done talk therapy, is very movie or creative or arty. And then lunchtime, sort of very similar to breakfast time, family style again. Then 2 groups in the afternoon, and that might be learning something about theories, some psychoeducation, some working on the family. We don't need to have all the family in the room to be able to put the foundations in on family therapy. And then so we've got 4 groups. Young people will come in and out of groups to take part in specialist groups. So it might be something around food and body, it might be something around self-harm, it might be something around social skills development. We may have young people preparing for the next stage and writing personal statements together. All those wonderful activities that they've taken part in Malaysia feed really well into a personal statement. The identity piece, I came to Malaysia because things were really tricky and I wasn't managing it on my own. It got really overwhelming. I'm coming back with this. This is my volunteer portfolio. This is my personal statement. I have 150 hours under my belt to add into my CV. So sort of preparing for the next space, not feeling like they're stuck and tree. And then in the evenings, we come out of all that and we ask, with the greatest respect, if the work that's being done can be left in our group rooms, and we go back into our sort of recreational house spaces and we have fun together. So it might mean everybody agreeing on, and that's quite a big thing, a movie. Like who's going to suggest something on Netflix and who's going to agree to it or not, and how do we make sure it's something that is friendly towards the audience that we have. Or it might be playing pool or Pac-Man. We've got the old giant Pac-Man arcade games with that's my favorite. I'm actually quite good at that. I like that a lot. I've had a lot of practice over the years. Um, so and then lots of creative things. So we've got a massive crochet community. We have, enough crocheters and enough balls of wool to create our own small village, I think. So time to do something different. We also have one outside activity a day so that we don't get stuck in stuckness. So it might be a treasure hunt, it might be tennis or badminton or going off to play volleyball or something that gets us moving. And quite often people will say, well, my previous treatment experience said my eating disorder was so bad that I'm not allowed to move. The whole essence again of being human is us moving, and we talk about flexibility and we talk about movement as a sort of human essence condition. And then we tell people that we're going to keep them in a bed and we're going to give them what they consider to be an awful lot of food, and we're not going to allow them to move. And then we wonder why they become more and more preoccupied. Another criteria for eating disorders, being preoccupied with food and body. But if I'm in a bed and I'm on a movement ban and you're feeding me and it's the worst thing in the world to me, how can I not be preoccupied with that? So what we do is we include everybody at every stage, as long as it's not a medical risk. So if we've got a young person who is in, a very small sized body at the moment and things are pretty tricky, what we need is more team members in order to adapt that activity so they can take part in some of it. So for me, it's about how do we put something in rather than how do we take something away. And I guess that goes right back to our first question about how did the wave start and how did I want it to feel and look.
And Fiona, one thing that occurs to me is while you're describing typical day, I mean, it really sounds like the people who visit you, they're in really safe hands, right? And you put your arms around them. Can you just talk to us for a second in terms of there's that point of care, and that might be a week or 2 weeks, a month, whatever it looks like. But at the time that the point of care finishes and they've made the progress that they're pleased with, or some progress to a certain degree, and it's time for them to go back to their, let's use, normal life. What are the mechanisms and the tools that you can give them to enable them to, when they do revert back to normal life, not to revert to some of those damaging practices, because it just sounds so wonderful there. And I think, if it was me, I'd want to be there all the time because I've got arms around me. People are caring about me. I just feel loved in that space, right? So there must be some level of fear when people on the horizon realize that, oh my goodness, real life is kind of back out there, and I'm not sure whether I want to face it.
And just to say as well, when I got to that point with my own mental health journey, it was more like I'm so afraid that I'm going to lose all this support that I'm going to just take it back a few steps, and I'm going to make things worse for myself
in order to
keep this support.
Okay, yeah.
And when I work with children and young people at the moment, I see that a lot. When things are coming to an end, it's like, oh, but actually, this is still happening for me, or this, so you can't discharge me yet. So I imagine there's a bit of that going on.
Absolutely right. Yes, that's exactly what we see. Both of your sort of viewpoints on that are exactly what we see. The It's very safe. It's very fun. Um, there's lots of activity. You're a sibling. You're a peer. You're a sibling. You've got your friends. I think the connections that people make also, because we're talking about things that you wouldn't ordinarily talk about at the checkout in Waitrose, it feels like those relationships are worth so much more than, what young people will say. Yes, but all my other relationships are very surface. It's not that. It's that we have a different job to do. And, when the lady in Tesco says to you, "Are you having a good day today?" she is expecting a different answer to the one that we're expecting in our process groups. And if we were to tell the lady in Tesco's all about how we're really feeling today, I think she would probably shut up shop and close her till down and run away the other direction. So I think we have a different experience, and it's quite difficult for young people to sometimes let go of that. We have quite a long level of stay, and we listen to families and we listen to young people. So the wave sort of evolved within that. So our lowest level of care is called the Park House, and it is much more about building up that step to get to the place that you're talking about. So they have cash money. No one has cash money anymore. They get cash ringgit, and then they have to convert it back to what that would be in dollars, and then whatever their own currency is. And they go shopping with a therapist and with a dietitian every Monday. And they have their kitchen and they're practicing. They work with, we've got a fantastic executive chef called Hamim. He was on cruise ships for 5 years before he came to us. So he is there and he does one-to-one cookery lessons with all of our young people and small groups sort of further up the levels of care. And they're building up their own recipe book for going home with, so that that recipe book's a bit of safety to take back home with you. So you say, "Oh, I'm really not feeling great today. I cannot do mum's rabbit casserole that she's been preparing for the last 48 hours. So I've got my recipe book, mum, and I've got them categorized into difficult day, easy day, share it with the family day. Mum, today I'm going to choose something from my really easy day thing. I'm going to put your recipe aside, and I know how to make it for myself. I've had loads of practice at this, and I know all the things that it makes me feel." So our recipe books they're like a normal recipe book, but it's got little bubbles around the top where it's got the ED voice or the not so well voice or the depressed voice or the anxious voice talking, to remind you what it might say to you, so that you can remind it that sometimes what it says is not necessarily true. So these little building blocks in there. So shopping, cooking, they run a book club once a week, just before shopping night. So they have to empty out the fridge, work together as a team, create a potluck, take it to the table and share it with our online alumni community. We have a lovely community that's very lively of young people who've gone home. I think I'm in their WhatsApp group, and it's a real pleasure to be in there. I think we probably have about 60 messages a day in there. And it can be anything from today's messages where I've been to IKEA and bought new pink bedding. I'm turning my room into a Hello Kitty zone. And my barista coffee machine is better than your barista coffee machine, and mine can be frothier than yours. We've got some days where people say, "Oh, I'm having a really bad day today." And you watch all these kids from all around the world rallying with their hope and vision and support and sparkle. And then some days we've got these silly conversations about, "My mum's just bought me 44 meters of pink ribbon and I'm going to tie it to anything that isn't nailed down." So we have a lot of support, but a lot of bringing back bits that are useful to young people. So quite often parents were saying to us, "We are scared to have them home." we are really scared, right? You've done a really good job. They're not doing that stuff anymore. We are terrified. So we've got a young person saying, I'm terrified. And then we've got a family saying, I'm terrified. And then we've got things like we run GCSEs, A levels, IB, and American credits. So we've got kids who we've managed to reintegrate some education where that hasn't necessarily worked before. And then parents going, well, I also don't know which school's going to take them. And then we're making applications to schools who say, oh no, we can't possibly take that level of risk, which, some of the time is fair. So the Park House was designed so that young people could manage a little bit more global citizenship. So rather than just the one day that we would do at Chin School, they could take on a couple of extra projects. So we've got some young people working in Kachara, which is a soup distribution kitchen, and they're cooking and distributing. We've got some young people making freezer meals that are being stockpiled for the winter when the floods come in. We don't really get a winter that's cold, but we get some flooding, so that they're able to distribute. We've got young people working behind the scenes with charities who are placing babies who have needed to be rehomed away from their family of origin. So they're taking on these projects, building up their life skills, building up their CV, building up their experience bank, which makes it a little bit easier going home. And then we're listening to parents saying, can you get them to the end of that school year in the way that you're doing it, rather than us transferring them and having this period of change? Young people, for all young people, change is pretty difficult. For us, change is really difficult, isn't it? So when you're balancing these sort of like very fine strings of recovery and you've got massive changes, we really know that there's going to be an impact. So we might have a family say, please, can we get to the end of August? Can they then come home for maybe a couple of weeks, get involved in some projects that are similar back home, and then start their new school or start university? And that, to us, makes a lot of sense than going back into the goldfish bowl that we talked about at the beginning of our conversation. It's about preparing.
I hear you talk quite passionately about what you do, and flexibility and reducing that black and white thinking, and allowing people to be very much part of their own recovery, the process and the autonomy. I wonder, the world has a long way to catch up on what you do and what you bring to young people. And I wonder if you ever feel frustrated that the world, globally, the world is quite slow at catching up in this idea of flexibility and, young people being able to make decisions that are really healthy for themselves.
Yeah, it is frustrating. And I quite often think about our teams, particularly people at the beginning of their careers, and the even the traditional training that we're given across all of the helping professions. So we've got social work and psychotherapy and psychologists and psychiatrists and dietitians. They're all still very much in their own little kind of circle. So we've got a sort of solar system of things, but they don't really overlap. I can spend phenomenal amounts of time interviewing dietitians who've had very, very, very little experience or knowledge around how to manage eating disorders, either in the community or inpatient. Psychiatrists who've had huge amounts of really great training, but not really in these really kind of key areas that we know are growing. This isn't, it crosses, the things that we're talking about cross all cultures, all backgrounds, all, socioeconomic places and positions, all countries, and yet we're not coming together, I don't believe, as a community. And I think latterly we've seen a move. We've had a bit of a shift, haven't we, from a very much a biomedical model to this sort of trauma informed model. Um, what that means again is another great big question. Things like that I find really frustrating. Uh, we've got people now describing themselves as trauma informed or trauma focused, but where's the benchmark? How do we measure that? Who makes the rule on that? How does that help us help young people? Because you choose to give yourself a label doesn't mean that you're going to be any more helpful than the lollipop lady. It really doesn't. You might get them from A to B, but you know that's it. So I think, yes, I find quite a lot of the way that mental health is approached, the resources that are put into mental health, the resources that are put into eating disorder research, the availability of professionals. How do you choose the treatment you get? Sometimes it's down to how readily available it is, how practitioners are left to their own devices, really, and how lonely it is to maybe be sitting in your consulting room in Glasgow and have somebody come into your room who's telling you what they are going to do next. And it's really scary. And how do you continue to hold that person? Because your neck will be on the proverbial chopping block if anything happens to that young person. But there also isn't anyone else. So I don't think we do a great job at supporting young people. I don't think we do a great job at supporting our practitioners. And I think we're much more about kind of pulling people down than we are about building people up. And the job that, we all do, our teams all do, our trainees all do on a daily basis is really, really, it takes a huge amount of commitment, love and courage to do that. And it takes a huge amount of courage for our young people to get in there and allow you to work with them on that basis. You can't make someone well. So many parents will say to me, "What are your outcome statistics? What is the likelihood of my child being well in 8 weeks? What is the statistical number of young people who never self-harm again?" Like, this isn't possible, and it's also not respectful to the young person. To them, success may be that they've got one friend. Parents quite often, professionals, grown-ups, adults, quite often forget that somebody else's vision of what it means to be in the world is not the same as ours. So if that young person comes to us and all they want is to find a friend who they can talk to about Hello Kitty and who doesn't sort of walk away from them or turn their back on them, that to them has been a successful treatment episode, or successful time away from home, or whatever, however they frame it. For somebody else it might be to get into school, but let's assume that that's for everyone, and let's not assume that all children, all young people have the same level of support outside of the mental health community. Families are not all built to be the same.
I love that.
Yeah, me too.
So in terms of wrapping up, um, at a high level, Fiona, I've got this juxtaposition, and again, I may be out on this, but I see around me quite negatively. My own perception is this kind of world and environment that just seems to get more and more challenging for the people in it, and yet on the other side of that, I see an ecosystem and a level of communication, transparency, openness, authenticity that seems to be thriving in the face of that difficult environment. And in terms of closing remarks, and I expect you to put glitter all over this, please. Um, but in terms of closing remarks, what are you seeing? I mean, you're at the proverbial coalface. Is the diagnostic or the prognosis or the outlook looking hopeful? Can we be hopeful about it in the mid to long term, or actually some days is it tough for you as well with all of that going on in terms of mid long term outlook? So I just wonder what your thoughts are there.
Mm. I think when we start to talk about things more and we make them more visible and we have names for them, and we can, you know, we didn't, I guess it's like a guest at a dinner party, isn't it? We didn't really sort of notice that they were there until they left the room, and then we realized that they were actually the most influential guest in the room. And I think that's kind of what happens around mental health. We've been operating one way where nobody really talked about it. It wasn't something that you could discuss, and your aunt, you know of an auntie somewhere at some point who was shipped off and never ever came back, and and that was considered to be mental health in the family. Um, and now we're starting to talk about it, and we're saying, let's break down walls, let's break down stigma, let's talk about it. And then when we talk about it, everybody says, "Oh my goodness, well, there's so much of this thing around. Is there any chance we can stop talking about it anytime soon? Yeah. Could we just wrap it up now or sweep it up? Can you cure it now?" So I guess what we've seen is a shift in what we didn't know. And acknowledging what we don't know is always really difficult for us, isn't it? So I guess we're going to continue to not know so many things, and we're going to continue with a degree of discomfort. And I think we are becoming wiser. We are able to look at the things that we don't know with some honesty and say, okay, well, we need to be finding out more about that. We also have tried a few things over the last few years in terms of the mental health community, and I think around identity and shifting, and then looked at it again and re-looked at it, and that takes a lot of bravery and courage. So if we can retain bravery, courage, curiosity, and flexibility, and a degree of spontaneity, then I think it is all really glittery. And I think if we can prevent ourselves from becoming rigid in what we do and thinking that we know best, we don't ever know best for a young person because they're them and we're not. So I think while we can retain that curiosity, as soon as we start going in telling people that we know what's wrong or we know what's right, we've actually lost it. We may as well just be quiet there and then. And so I think there is a lot of hope. I think there's an awful lot to do, and there's a lot of things that we could do better. I think looking back at the lockdown and being locked in, there's a lot of press around how dreadfully kids had that time, and how we're seeing this massive uptake in mental health conditions because of that time. But again, in that, no one's mentioning the parents. So that was bi-directional. They were living with a kid during that time, and they were trying to work, and they were trying to do all those things. So what's happened to the quality of parenting and the quality of family over those years? That bit is being missed. Headline says self-harm's gone up, whatever it is, percent. Hospital admissions are not able to cope with that. But again, what's happening to the system? Because we can take that child into the hospital bed, but it's going to go home again. So I think moving forward for me, if we could stop looking at things on such an individualistic basis and start looking at the network around it, I think as a treatment network, we could meet societal networks in a way that we could be potentially doing more.
Amazing.
Fiona, thank you so much. I have been so excited this week about coming to talk to you. I think I could listen and have a conversation with you all day. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Fiona.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed being with you. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I'd love to come and see you again on episode 52.
Fantastic. Good stuff.